At 6:42 in the morning on May 20th, 1941, the sky over western Crete trembled. Silk canopies burst open above Malema Aerodrome. Shadows dropped through the first light, hundreds at a time, drifting like a storm no one had predicted. Boots hit olive groves. Rifle straps snapped against helmets. The quiet between each parachute felt like a warning. On the ground stood a sergeant who had never fired a shot in combat. Alfred Clive Hulme watched the invasion unfold from the field punishment center he was ordered to guard. 23 men beside him, all wearing the stain of mistakes, fighting drunk, stealing rations, speaking out of turn. Bad men on paper. Soldiers when the sky turned black. By noon that day, German snipers were already cutting down officers and radio men. Each shot felt like a thread pulled from the battalion's spine. Hulme understood one truth. If he could not find the men behind those rifles, the retreat would collapse long before it reached the sea. What pushed an ordinary sergeant to attempt a tactic no manual had ever dared to print? And how did one stolen rifle alter the fate of hundreds? If you know someone who served, share their name stories like this helped shape every home across America. Crete in May of 1941 was not a battlefield shaped for mercy. The island rose in steep folds of rock and clay, olive groves clustered in tight pockets, and every ridge offered a clear line of sight toward the sea. The New Zealanders who had arrived only weeks earlier found themselves defending a landscape built for the patient marksman rather than the advancing infantryman. German Fallschirmjäger understood this instinctively. Their doctrine depended on sudden arrival, scattered formations, and a fast tightening of control around choke points. The terrain made their rifles even more lethal. When the first wave of parachutes drifted down, the defenders still believed they could repel a frontal assault. What they could not see until officers began collapsing was the invisible web of sniper fire that wrapped around Malema Aerodrome. German marksmen worked in pairs, moving after each shot, slipping between ruined stone walls and the folds of the hillsides. Their Karabiner 98 rifles, fitted with Zeiss optics, gave them clarity at long distances. The splinter-patterned camouflage smocks broke their outlines in the sun. They did not need many rounds. One shot was enough when the targets were radio operators, forward observers, or the few officers who still stood to direct movements. Standard counter-sniper doctrine failed almost immediately. Machine gun suppression could not reach men operating from shadowed crevices. Each sniper kill forced another withdrawal, another shift in the defensive line, another loss of structure. Commanders spoke quietly about how the battalion's spine was being cut piece by piece. By the second afternoon, internal reports estimated dozens of casualties attributable solely to sniper fire. The stakes grew clearer as the German presence thickened. The Fallschirmjäger had suffered losses during the drop, but their scattered landings produced a chaotic strength. Independent shooters, small roaming groups, and loosely connected units that could infiltrate defensive zones from multiple angles. That chaos created confusion for both sides, but only one force was trained to exploit it. To the New Zealanders, the battlefield looked like a chalkboard, erased halfway lines blurred, shapes moving unpredictably, no clear map to rely on. In this environment, distance became a weapon. A retreating column had no choice but to follow the roads cut between the hills. Each bend in the track became an exposed moment, a brief flare of vulnerability. Officers began to crouch as they spoke. Runners crossed terrain in short bursts, waiting for the burn of a shot that could come at any moment. More alarming was the rhythm of the losses. A single sniper might claim 5 or 10 victims before shifting position. Multiply that by several hidden shooters, and the battalion's structure could unravel by evening. The doctrine for countering such threats required patient observation hours spent watching a slope for a flicker of movement, the blink of a scope, or a mistake in camouflage. Crete offered none of that time. Every minute lost brought German reinforcements closer to the ridgelines that dominated the withdrawal routes. Retreat was already being discussed in low voices, but retreat through sniper terrain meant something else, a running loss of command, cohesion, and morale. To understand the operating pressures on Hulme's unit, one must picture the narrow roads around Malema. The distances were small, 300 yards between olive groves, 200 yards between stone walls, 30 yards between terrace levels, but the angles were brutal. A man standing upright on a lower track could be visible to multiple vantage points. Snipers positioned at slightly different elevations could triangulate kill zones without speaking a word. In this environment, distance became a weapon. A German sniper positioned 200 or 300 yards up a slope could see the entire valley floor. Officers began to crouch as they spoke. Runners crossed terrain in short bursts, waiting for the burn of a shot that could come at any moment. More alarming was the rhythm of the losses. A single sniper might claim 5 or 10 victims before shifting position. The doctrine for countering such threats required patient observation hours, spent watching a slope for a flicker of movement, the blink of a scope, or a mistake in camouflage. Crete offered none of that time. Every minute lost brought German reinforcements closer to the ridgelines that dominated the withdrawal routes. Retreat was already being discussed in low voices, but retreat through sniper terrain meant something else, a running loss of command, cohesion, and morale. To understand the operating pressures on Hulme's unit, one must picture the narrow roads around Maleme. The distances were small, 300 yards between olive groves, 200 yards between stone walls, 30 yards between terrace levels, but the angles were brutal. A man standing upright on a lower track could be visible to multiple vantage points. Snipers positioned at slightly different elevations could triangulate kill zones without speaking a word. Even at ranges of 400 yards, the Zeiss scopes allowed German marksmen to distinguish a radio pack from a bedroll. They chose their targets deliberately. For the New Zealanders, every technical factor favored the enemy. The night belonged to German infiltrators who crawled between positions with near-silent precision. The day belonged to snipers who fired from high ground. Commanders noted that suppressive fire could sometimes force an enemy rifle down, but it rarely ended the threat. You could not suppress what you could not locate. This was the environment into which Alfred Clive Hulme stepped, an environment that punished hesitation. His early attempts at traditional counter-sniper work followed the manual: find dead ground, observe patiently, wait for an opening. The method worked, but it was too slow. Every hour spent hunting one German marksman meant more Allied dead across the valley. And those losses were not random. The Germans targeted officers first. Without them, formations stalled. A stalled formation in sniper terrain was a death sentence. What turned the situation critical was the realization that the Fallschirmjäger operated without tight unit cohesion. Small groups wandered between positions, sometimes passing each other without challenge. The chaos of the airborne drop made identification sloppy. A man in the right uniform, carrying the right rifle, moving with confidence, could walk through multiple positions without raising a single question. To most soldiers, this weakness in the German structure was a footnote. To a man willing to exploit it, it was a doorway. When Hulme discovered the dead German paratrooper, the young man lying in the dust with a splinter-patterned smock and a rifle still warm from battle, the balance shifted. The uniform was not just camouflage. It was a key into the sniper network itself. The carbine, with its Zeiss scope, offered the clarity and precision that the New Zealand rifles lacked. But more importantly, the uniform allowed movement through contested terrain without drawing fire. It dissolved the silhouette that Allied snipers could not hide, and German snipers trusted implicitly. The operating parameters of Hulme's decision were brutally simple: close distance to within 20 or 30 yards, where one shot meant certainty. Eliminate the sniper before he could react. Withdraw without firing a second round from the same position. Repeat. The risk was absolute. Discovery meant immediate death under international law. Enemy uniform, enemy rifle, there would be no quarter. Yet the logic was clear. If each German sniper could claim 10 Allied lives in a day, then eliminating one sniper was equivalent to saving a squad. Eliminating 10 meant saving a company. In the dense terrain of Crete, where retreat routes narrowed into exposed corridors, those numbers meant survival or collapse. By the time Hulme made his choice, the stakes were no longer tactical. They were existential. The battalion's ability to withdraw depended on breaking the invisible web stretched across the hillsides. Traditional doctrine would fail under the weight of time. Only deception, dangerous, intimate, and irreversible, offered a chance to turn the German strengths against them. And so, the battlefield shifted. One man, wearing a dead soldier's smock, began walking toward the rifles that no one else could find. The first test of Hulme's new method began at 7:45 on the morning of May 23rd. The air was still cool, the light cutting through the olive branches in narrow shafts. Hulme moved as though he belonged there, shoulders relaxed, boots steady, rifle slung across his back the way a Fallschirmjäger might carry it after a long night repositioning. From 200 yards away, any German soldier would see nothing unusual. A man in splinter-patterned camouflage, moving between fields that their own troopers had crossed at dawn. Ahead of him lay the ruins of a stone farmhouse. One wall remained upright, forming a windowless frame overlooking the coastal road. A German sniper had turned it into a hide. Through his field glasses, Hulme saw the man settle his elbows, adjust the scope, and begin scanning the road with slow discipline. The professional calm of someone who expected to fire soon and fire accurately. Hulme approached from the east, walking openly, letting the dry grass whisper under his boots. The sniper looked at him once, just a glance, and then returned to the road. That flicker of recognition, the unspoken "he's one of ours," was all Hulme needed. At 25 yards, he raised the stolen rifle and fired. The shot echoed once off the stone. He stepped over the threshold and took the man's ammunition. 120 rounds, 3 grenades, and a folded map marked with New Zealand positions. It was the confirmation he needed. German intelligence was tracking the battalion's movements closely. Every sniper he killed meant one fewer set of eyes, marking the withdrawal routes. By noon that day, Hulme had repeated the pattern 3 more times. The rhythm became almost mechanical. Walk, close, fire once. Each kill happened within shouting distance of the target, but there were no shouts. The deception erased the seconds in which alarm might have risen. It was a method built not on stealth but on the enemy's trust in their own uniform. That afternoon, New Zealand patrols noticed something unusual. The sniper fire that had pinned them for 2 days began to fade. Runners crossed roads without dropping. Radio operators completed transmissions without diving behind rocks. Officers raised their heads above cover. No one knew why. They only knew the air felt lighter, as if a pressure had eased. The next morning, May 24th, Hulme took the method deeper into German-held ground. The shifting front had created pockets of infantry who operated with almost no coordination. Fallschirmjäger units were reassessing their positions, relocating ammo, consolidating what remained of scattered platoons. In that chaos, a single man in the right uniform could pass within 10 feet of enemy soldiers and receive nothing more than a nod. At 2:30 that afternoon, he moved through a German assembly area near Galatas. An officer, an Oberleutnant, approached with the sharp stride of someone delivering instructions. He pointed toward the ridge east of town and spoke quickly. Hulme nodded, said nothing, and walked exactly where he was directed. The officer turned away, never realizing he had just given tactical guidance to a New Zealand sergeant who would use it to overwhelm the next sniper position. By that evening, Hulme's tally reached 11. The battalion commander tried to order him to stand down and rest, but the order never held. German snipers were still working the hills. If Hulme stopped, someone else would pay the price. The morning of May 25th marked a brutal shift. New Zealand troops launched a counterattack to recapture Galatas. The Germans held a schoolhouse at the western edge of the village, turning it into a strong point with overlapping fields of machine gun fire. The first attack stalled within minutes. Men pinned behind corners could not move without being cut down. Hulme did not wait for permission. He slipped forward alone, moving through broken walls and fallen timbers until he reached the ground floor windows. 3 stick grenades hung from his belt. He pulled the pins in quick succession and threw them through the openings. The explosions rolled through the building like thunder trapped inside a box. The machine gun fell silent. The counterattack surged forward. Galatas fell by late afternoon, only to be lost again within 24 hours. German reinforcements crashed through the town at night, and by May 26th, the New Zealanders were already withdrawing towards Suda Bay. Hulme was found briefly at the battalion assembly area, reading the message about his younger brother's death under heavy fire northeast of the village. He folded the paper into his pocket without ceremony. Something behind his expression hardened. The next day became the turning point of his campaign. At 5 o'clock on the morning of May 27th, the withdrawal towards Suda Bay began with the precision of a retreat under pressure. German units pressed from behind, trying to break the rearguard and scatter the battalion. Snipers moved with them, slipping into ridges bordering the road. Hulme watched them from a hillside, studying their angles, their favored shadows, their pacing. He knew exactly what they were trying to do: break the chain of command, isolate NCOs, shoot officers who dared point or gesture. At 5:20, he located the first sniper, an experienced shooter climbing into a rocky perch 300 yards south of the road. Hulme adjusted the Zeiss scope, waited for the man to settle, and fired. The German tumbled backward into the rocks. He shifted position immediately. A sniper firing twice from the same location might as well paint a target on his chest. At 6:15, he killed the second. At 7:30, the third. By 9 o'clock, 5 German snipers were dead. The battalion's movement tightened, their formation no longer frayed by invisible fire. No one knew why the snipers had stopped. They only knew the silence felt unnatural. The real storm came late that morning. At 10:45, German snipers took positions above the battalion's exposed left flank, choosing a slope that overlooked the valley like a knife poised to drop. Their vantage points gave them clear shots at any soldier moving below. If they remained there, the withdrawal could collapse into a slaughter. Hulme approached from the north. He saw the men wave, relaxed, calling out in casual German. At 40 yards, one of them walked toward him, smiling, asking a question Hulme couldn't understand. He shot the man through the chest. The others froze for half a heartbeat. One of their own had killed one of their own. Hulme used that hesitation ruthlessly. 4 more shots, 4 more dead. Among their gear, he found 400 rounds of ammunition and written orders detailing German knowledge of New Zealand movements. Their intelligence was precise. Without intervention, the retreat would have been shredded. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, Hulme's total kills reached 16. Lieutenant Colonel Leckie caught him during a brief halt. He asked whether Hulme could continue operating independently. The answer was yes. Hulme did not mention his brother. At 4:30, Hulme moved ahead of the battalion again, scouting the next valley terrain that could trap the entire unit if snipers arrived first. He found 3 Germans waiting in the rocks, rifles angled down the slope. He killed them all before the first New Zealand soldier entered the valley. The battalion passed through untouched. That night, his kill count reached 19, a number unmatched by any Allied counter-sniper in such a short span. But the next day would be even more dangerous. At 4:30 on the morning of May 28th, the battalion withdrew towards Stylos. The ridge overlooking the road gave the Germans every advantage, height, cover, and angles that overlapped like the spokes of a wheel. If they established themselves there, the retreat would end in minutes. At 5:15, Hulme reached the ridge and saw the mortar crew, 4 men, assembling a Granatwerfer 34, its barrel already aligned toward the road below. 60 mortar rounds sat beside it, enough to break the battalion in a single sustained volley. He was 800 yards away, too far for accuracy. By the time he reported the position, men would die. So he moved. Dead ground, folds in the ridge, narrow shadows, anything that brought him closer. For the final 300 yards, there was no cover at all. He simply walked forward as if he belonged among them. 1 German waved. Another asked a question. At 15 yards, Hulme raised the rifle and fired. 2 Germans fell where they stood. The remaining 2 reached for their rifles, but Hulme shot them before they could lift them. He threw the firing mechanism down the slope and kicked the ammunition boxes after it. The ridge gave him a wide view of the terrain. He spotted 3 more snipers moving into the rocks along the western approach. They were setting up a coordinated kill zone. He moved swiftly, 1 shot, then another. The 3rd sniper turned too soon, caught a glimpse of the wrong face. Hulme fired first, but the German got off a round as he fell. The bullet tore through Hulme's left shoulder. He wrapped the wound in a strip of cloth torn from a dead man's uniform. The bleeding slowed, but the arm was nearly useless. At 8:30, he saw another sniper creeping toward the road target number 34. Hulme braced the rifle with one hand, fired, missed. The German returned fire, hitting the same shoulder and shattering bone. Hulme fell behind the rocks. The rifle lost down the slope. The footsteps came closer, cautious, deliberate. Hulme grabbed a stone, threw it left. The German pivoted. In that instant, Hulme hurled a heavier rock into the man's head, knocking him off balance. They collided, struggling in the dust. A knife flashed. Hulme drove forward with everything he had left until the man stopped moving. For several minutes, he lay on the ridge, unable to rise. Blood pooled beneath him. Below, the withdrawal route cleared. The battalion was gone. He was alone. He crawled downhill, dragging his ruined arm. At 9:40, a New Zealand patrol found him collapsed on the road 2 miles from Stylos. Behind them, German snipers, those who remained, were silent. Night on Crete did not bring silence. It brought a different kind of weight. The wind moved through the olive branches like breath through an old house, and every sound carried farther than it should. For the men of the 23rd Battalion, sleep came in minutes, not hours. They lay on cold ground with rifles across their chests, listening for the single crack that might end a life before anyone had time to speak a name. Hulme walked among men who were exhausted long before dawn, mechanics with grime still under their nails from repairing trucks by moonlight, runners whose boots were worn thin from sprinting between shattered positions, young privates who flinched at the echo of distant gunfire, unsure whether it marked the death of someone they knew. Fear was not an abstract word on Crete. It had a sound, a rhythm, a posture. Men carried it in their shoulders, in the way they spoke only when necessary, in the way their eyes searched the ridgelines before they searched the road. He understood their fear because he felt it himself. Each time he walked into German-held ground, wearing the splinter-patterned smock, he felt the weight of his brother's absence. The message folded in his pocket was heavier than the rifle on his back. Harold had marched into the same dust, under the same sun. The knowledge pressed against Hulme's chest with every step. Among the troops, rumors formed quietly. Some said a New Zealander was hunting the snipers alone. Others said the Germans were withdrawing their marksmen. No one imagined the truth that the man moving through the hills wore an enemy's uniform, or that he passed within arm's length of German soldiers who greeted him with a wave. Soldiers at the aid stations whispered about positions suddenly free of sniper fire. Radio operators spoke of transmissions completed without interruption for the first time in days. Human lives were measured differently during the withdrawal. A man who reached a medical tent became a story that might continue. A man who fell on the road often did not. The medics who carried stretchers worked until their hands bled through their bandages. Their kits held fewer supplies each day. The smell of antiseptic faded as days passed, replaced by the sting of dust and sweat and the copper-sweet tang of blood. When Hulme staggered down the ridge on May 28th, dragging his useless arm across the stones, he carried not triumph, but the exhaustion of a man who had given every part of himself. The patrol that found him did not see a hero. They saw a soldier on the edge of collapse, covered in dirt and dried blood, his face pale from the fight he refused to leave unfinished. The men who carried him on a stretcher did so quietly. They knew what he had done. They knew what it had cost him. And in the slowing breath of a wounded sergeant, they heard something they had been missing for days, the fragile, stubborn sound of a life that had not yet given up. Across the wider map of the war, the story unfolding on Crete was only one line in a long column of crises, yet it carried consequences far beyond the island's rocky slopes. For American analysts following the conflict from Washington, the German airborne assault offered a glimpse into a new kind of warfare, fast, silent, unpredictable. It was the largest airborne operation the world had ever seen, and it showed how a well-trained force could turn altitude into advantage. But it also revealed something more subtle, the limits of even the most elite units when facing determined defenders in difficult terrain. Crete demonstrated that airborne troops, once scattered, became vulnerable to disruption. German commanders learned that lesson at enormous cost. The thousands of casualties suffered in just 11 days forced Hitler to abandon large-scale airborne operations for the rest of the war. In American military circles, that decision was studied with quiet interest. It showed how a single battle, even a defeat for the Allies, could reshape enemy doctrine. Airborne divisions would still play a role in the broader conflict, but never again at the scale attempted over Crete. For the United States, which had not yet fully entered the war in May 1941, the reports from Crete offered an early study in asymmetric resistance. Small units fighting from disadvantage had found ways, some improvisational, some desperate, to slow a superior enemy. When American officers later planned operations in the Pacific and Europe, they looked carefully at how defenders on Crete used terrain, movement, and timing to preserve their forces during withdrawal. The lesson was not about victory, it was about endurance. Hulme's actions were a footnote in those early assessments, yet the logic he demonstrated did not go unnoticed. American strategists recognized the principle behind his decisions. When conventional doctrine fails, initiative and adaptation become the only tools left. In later campaigns, from the jungles of Guadalcanal to the hedgerows of Normandy, American forces relied heavily on the ability of small units to adjust on the edge of collapse. Hulme had shown, in the harsh clarity of 8 days, how one man could shift the tempo of a battlefield simply by thinking differently. Globally, the fall of Crete signaled a change in how nations understood airborne warfare. Britain tightened its defenses across the Mediterranean, anticipating that Germany might attempt similar operations elsewhere. The Soviet Union, watching from afar, took note of the risk airborne troops faced when dropped behind fortified lines. And across the Atlantic, American planners recognized that any future war would require not only technological strength, but also soldiers capable of making rapid, unscripted decisions under extreme pressure. The island itself remained under German occupation for years, but the ideas born there traveled far. Crete became a study in limits of doctrine, logistics, and human endurance. And in the center of that study stood a quiet sergeant whose impact reached far beyond the hills he fought on. The Battle of Crete ended on May 31st, 1941. 11 days of confusion, fierce resistance, scattered landings, and brutal retreats finally closed with a single truth. The island belonged to Germany. More than 3,500 Allied soldiers were dead, 12,000 captured, and the survivors carried the weary silence of men who had fought under skies darkened by parachutes. The retreat to the southern beaches, though successful for many, left behind questions that would follow them for years. For the New Zealanders of the 23rd Battalion, one fact grew clearer as the evacuation reports took shape. The sniper fire that had torn through their lines during the first days had nearly vanished during the final week. Casualty sheets reflected the shift with a precision that left little room for interpretation. Between May 20th and May 22nd, the battalion lost 47 men to sniper fire. Between May 23rd and May 30th, they lost 6. In a retreat measured by hours and narrow margins, that difference meant survival for hundreds. Hulme's 33 confirmed sniper kills, achieved in just 8 days, appeared in every official record that followed. But numbers alone could not express what those kills represented. Each German sniper removed from the ridgelines meant one less shot fired at a radio operator carrying orders, one less bullet striking a sergeant directing men across open ground, one less officer collapsing mid-command. The exact number of lives saved could never be calculated, but veterans understood the truth intuitively. Without those 8 days of deception and close-range precision, the battalion's route to the evacuation beaches would have been marked by far more bodies. Strategically, the loss of Crete remained a bitter chapter. The island fell. The Allies retreated. The price was heavy. Yet the Germans paid dearly as well, more than 4,000 dead, 2,500 wounded. Their elite airborne divisions suffered losses so severe that Hitler refused to authorize another major airborne offensive for the rest of the war. An entire branch of German initiative had been effectively removed from the battlefield because of what happened on Crete. For Hulme, the legacy was quieter. His Victoria Cross, awarded months later, recorded the technical details, destroyed sniper positions, neutralized machine gun nests, decisive actions during the withdrawal from Stylos. But the citation omitted the stolen smock, the deception, the long, solitary walks into enemy-held terrain. It omitted the moment he found his brother's death confirmed in a few lines of handwriting. The official record captured courage. It did not capture cost. After the war, historians tried to understand how one man had managed what entire units struggled to do. Some pointed to the confusion of the airborne assault, others to the dispersed nature of German formations. A few argued that no doctrine could explain it, that Hulme's success came from a rare combination of nerve, intuition, and grief sharpened into focus. Several soldiers attempted similar tactics in North Africa. None survived. Hulme's own life returned to stillness after the war. The medal sat in a drawer. The memories stayed behind his silence. When asked whether he regretted anything, he answered only that the 34th sniper had escaped him. It was not bravado. It was the unfinished line of a story he never wanted to tell. His actions remain a paradox in the history of the Second World War, a tactical brilliance nested inside a strategic failure. Crete fell, yet the lives he saved rippled outward through every man who boarded a ship, returned to his unit, or lived long enough to go home. The effect was real, even if the maps did not show it. The island is quiet now. The ridgelines where snipers once watched the valleys are covered in sunlight and brush. No rifle barrels glint in the distance. No footsteps move cautiously over stone. But the silence holds memory. The kind earned the hard way, on days when survival depended on a single man walking toward danger when everyone else was told to retreat. If stories like this resonate with your own family history, share a name or a memory in the comments. These accounts survive because people choose to remember them. And if you want to continue exploring the hidden corners of the Second World War, stories of sacrifice, ingenuity, and the fragile threads that shaped entire campaigns stay with us. Subscribe to WW2 Secret Archives and help ensure that none of these lives, or the lessons they left behind, disappear into silence.